go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Turn to the text itself. And last time, I think we were here last time we met, I think we briefly covered what they're calling confession of negativities or purification. Didn't we cover that briefly? Do I remember right? Okay. I was trying to make sure last time it helped me. So the section we're on, just to be clear, because not everybody was here last time, the section we're on is in the Stages of the Path to Enlightenment, the middle-length text by Lama Tsongkhapa. We're in a section where he's describing kind of what to do in all different, so this text covers all different topics of meditation. But the section we're on now is the section on the kind of what to do in each session of meditation. So we started off with how to set up a space for meditation, how to keep that space clean and neat and so on, how you sit down and sort of begin your session, the posture. And now we're on this practice called the 7 limbs, which he says one should do. He advises, and all the masters of all the masters of Tibet actually suggest this 7-limb practice. It's in all the traditions. Everybody does the 7 limbs. Actually, it comes from the Buddha, right? Many of the quotes in this section are from a teaching of the Buddha, and Lama Tsongkhapa is quoting the Buddha, actually. So, anyway, so we're going through the 7 limbs, and he describes at the end why you do them. He described it at the beginning, and he describes it in more detail at the end. So we'll just keep going, and we'll get to that. But so the one that we're up to now, the practice we're up to out of the 7 limbs is rejoicing. And actually, so let's focus a little bit on rejoicing, which is a happy topic to talk about. It's an interesting word, right? Rejoicing. So the idea of rejoicing in this sense, in Buddhist practice, actually, there are various practices, but this practice of rejoicing, is one where you think of positive things, right? So you would think of either, and positive things, I say that broadly because it can be, he's going to go through a list here, Lama Tsongkhapa will, but you think, first of all, you can think of all different kinds of beings, yourself, or including yourself and including others. And then you can think of either positive actions that you yourself or others have done, or positive results. Does that make sense? So this is about karma, right? So sort of positive things, like acts of love or kindness, and then also positive results, like positive experiences people have. And then you actually practice, right? Cultivating a sense of feeling joy, feeling happiness, feeling blissed out, feeling ecstatic, feeling whatever, something in that range, right? About those things. I want to mention something about it. First of all, I want to share, this is outside the text, but I'll just share it because I think it's true, is that one thing I've noticed, particularly in the West, actually, which I think might be different in Tibet, I'm not sure, Tibetan culture. But one thing I've noticed is that, most people have a hard time, most Westerners at least, have a hard time rejoicing in their own positive actions. They either think it's, grandiose or narcissistic or something like that. Actually, I work as a psychologist, one thing I'll say is narcissists actually don't take joy in their own positive actions. They take joy in their negative. Actually, they're not able to feel genuine joy about the positive things that they do. This ability, Buddhist psychology really is saying, this ability to feel joyful about your own positive actions and other people's positive actions is healthy and is positive. Does that make sense? And I sometimes think actually that it's related to healthy self-esteem. Like, you know, because what they're pointing out is that feeling joy in your own positive, I'm just getting, we're actually going to get to other people's positive actions in a second, but if you can't feel joy in your own positive actions, what's left to feel joy in, actually, right? Like, and, you know, if you, and, you know, as Dalai Lama often says, right, what's he say? You know, I think the purpose of life is to be happy. So if you're not going to be happy about what the good things you do, then what's left to be happy about? It seems a bit funny. And so so let's start, even though Lama Tsongkhapa here gets into others, he gives the example of others, let's start with ourselves, right? So the idea would be, right, that you would think back, right? That you would actually sort of, in this let's start with ourselves, right? So if you're meditating on rejoicing, you would sort of think back and you would think, oh wow, like the other day I really cultivated love, right? And then I did, you know, and I just meditated on that, or I did something loving for somebody. And you would think like, wow, that's beautiful, like, that's wonderful, you know. That's the most, you know, that's one of the more beautiful things in the world, right? To do anything out of love. And actually, it's easy in a way to rejoice. And one easy thing about rejoicing on our own positive actions is we can actually tell what we were feeling because we have introspection. With others, you have to guess if they were actually feeling love or not. Sometimes you can feel it, but oftentimes you have to guess. With yourself, you can know, you know. Or wow, I meditated on bodhicitta yesterday. How cool is that? Like, you know, how wonderful. Like, there's nothing, you know, the Buddha, all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas said there's nothing better than that. I myself can see there's nothing better than that, right? Love for all and compassion for all beings. Like, that's beautiful. How wonderful I actually did that. I could have wasted my time, like, watching a stupid TV show, and instead I meditated on compassion for all beings. That's wonderful. So, like, you would actually cultivate that. But actually, and I want to say something else, too. So one is, I think, I've noticed it's hard for sometimes Westerners to do this for whatever reason. The other is, people sometimes when they start doing this say, well, I don't feel it. I'm just saying how wonderful. Right? And what I always say, this is true actually, in Buddhist psychology is, Shantideva says, whatever we're familiar with happens easily, but the unfamiliar is difficult. And he says that's why it's really easy for us, for ordinary people, to feel anger and pride and jealousy and craving and desire. And it's hard to feel universal compassion or joy because we're just not familiar with it. So if it doesn't feel natural, some people say it doesn't feel naturally, I'm going to stop. And that'd be like the person going to the gym the first time going, that was kind of hard, I'm not going back there. Like, that's just the wrong idea, right? Like, in other words, if it's hard, that just means you haven't done it enough. And you know, so, and Shantideva actually says something else comparing it to the Dalai Lama. Sometimes draws this analogy, I think, actually, which it's coming from Shantideva. Is this idea, you know, with the body also, you can only, through familiarity, you can only get to a certain level of, we have our limitations, in other words, right? But Shantideva and Dalai Lama both point out, the mind is limitless, actually. Whereas the mind's ability, because it's clear and knowing, the nature of mind itself is sort of this clarity that's aware. And so when it comes to mental qualities, the more you familiarize with them, the more they can increase and they can become limitless. And so the idea of this is, if you start to do that, if you think of your own positive quality or positive action or positive trait, and you don't feel much, what that means is you haven't done this enough, right? And so the idea would be that if you keep doing that, that the mind can expand its capacity for joy more and more and more, and then you become quite joyful, is the idea. Then I'll kind of give more commentary in a sec, but I want to go back to the verse. I'm going to have more general ideas, but here in this text, Lama Tsongkhapa gives 5 different examples of whose deep positive deeds you might rejoice in. Does that make sense? So he's kind of giving you a guideline for meditation. And he says the first category is the victors, that means the Buddhas of the 10 directions. Right? So he says you can rejoice in the actions of all the Buddhas. Shakyamuni Buddha, who's the historical Buddha, but actually from all Buddhist perspectives, there are limitless Buddhas. In other words, all Buddhist traditions agree that Shakyamuni Buddha was not the only Buddha. There were previous Buddhas and there will be future Buddhas. So the idea here is that you think of all the fully enlightened beings and you rejoice in their actions, right? In their enlightenment and their compassion and their... The second category, he says, are the Buddha's children. Actually, I was just looking at this comment. there's a commentary that says Buddha's children has 3 different possible meanings. This is from the actual scholarly point. One is the Buddha actually had a child. It's one son, right? I think what was his name? Rahula. Yeah. So it's like that's one way of interpreting that. That's a superficial interpretation. Second interpretation of the Buddha's children, which is not what this one's referring. This one's referring to the third, by the way. But the first is his actual son, his historical child. Second is they call the children of the Buddha's speech, and those are the arhats, the actual disciples of the Buddha, who listened to his teachings and achieved liberation from samsara. But then this is referring to the third category of Buddha's children, which means the bodhisattvas. And what that means really is Buddha's children in this sense, one is that, and they call those the children of the Buddha's mind or heart, which I think is quite beautiful, actually. Right? And the idea there is that the bodhisattvas are those who generated universal compassion and universal responsibility and the bodhicitta aspiration to become enlightened for the sake of all beings. And so in one sense, they're like the Buddha's children in the sense that, like if somebody has a child, right, then that child is going to grow up to be the same species as them or something, to kind of be like them in some sense. And that it's the bodhisattvas who grow up to be Buddhas, who eventually become Buddhas. So in that sense, the Buddha's children. And also in a sense that that's the main meaning of that. And also in a sense, also it means that the Buddha's mind arose from bodhicitta itself, and so in a sense that they've taken on the heart that the Buddha himself practiced to become a Buddha. Right? So in that sense, also they're like children of the Buddha. Then solitary realizers, those are those beings like sometimes in Sanskrit they're called Pratyeka Buddhas. Right? So those are beings who achieve their own liberation. They're not bodhisattvas. They don't become fully enlightened. They're not in that. That's not their aspiration to become fully enlightened. Their aspiration is to achieve their own liberation. But they're a specific kind where they said they practice for 100 eons to create merit, and they want to become enlightened at a time when no Buddha's around. They're kind of independent, spirited people. So they don't want to become the arhats, like who were pictured sometimes on either side of the Buddha. I don't think they're pictured of the arhat. Sometimes there are 2 arhats pictured. Those are the fourth category, or this learners and no more learners, that one, which are like people who are, that's referring to the people who actually, who achieve their own liberation. They're not bodhisattvas either, they achieve arhatship, but under the direction or under the guidance of a Buddha directly. Whereas these solitary realizers study with a Buddha but then practice for eons in order to achieve enlightenment on their own, when no Buddha's around. It's like independent mind. And then the last category is, and of each and every migrating being. So that means of everyone, right? Including yourself, so that's why it was okay to start with ourselves. Okay, so he's just, basically if you look at this verse, what he's basically giving you is a description of every kind of being that exists. And he's saying anything good that any being ever did is something to rejoice in. Now I want to, so oftentimes when you do these 7 limbs, there'll be a verse, right, where you'll say, I rejoice in the activity of it. And that's just verbal rejoicing, actually, which is good, but the real rejoicing, of course, is in your mind. And so this is actually a practice, right? And I wanted to point out a couple things about it. One is, in a different text, he doesn't say here, Lama Tsongkhapa says, rejoicing is the easiest practice for creating extensive good karma or positivity. And he kind of says, he doesn't use this word, but basically it's like, if you're a little bit lazy, this is an easy way to practice positivity. And it's quite true, actually, right? Like there are some practices, like we did earlier, one of the 7 limbs is prostrations, right? So like, prostrations are physically difficult. Rejoicing, you can like lay around and watch other people prostrate. And say, how cool they're doing that, that's wonderful. You can lay there in bed and think, oh wow, there are like people who like, do all these like wonderful things in the world, who are like serving in really difficult places, how great. And it's like, for lazy people, it's quite an easy way. And the idea of rejoicing actually is interesting. It gets us, I want to share also something about karma in relation to rejoicing. Right, karma means action, right, or cause and effect of action. Action really is the translation of karma. But it's, but it's also the cause and effect of actions, right, what our actions lead to, right? And one thing that the teachings on karma say is that karma is mainly created by the mind, right? And, they give examples, right, like in other words, if you, if somebody builds a hospital and their main motivation is to have their name on the outside so that people will say, wow, you built a hospital, how cool. You know, if that's the main motivation, that's not really a positive action, right? Because the motivation is actually what? You know, craving after people thinking you're great. That's not particularly positive. You know, what makes an action positive is that it's done with a positive motivation. Right? And then karma is mainly created by the mind, actually, right? So it's like the main thing that makes the power of an action is the power of the person's motivation. And they say that in the teachings on karma. We'll get to them in detail later in this text, actually. But, you know, so for example, if somebody hurts another person out of extreme hatred, that's much worse than hurting somebody by accident, right? And we feel that, actually, don't we? I mean, you know that in your own experience, right? There is like, either one might feel bad, but you know later, but actually for both people, right? Whereas if the person who was hurt and if the person who did the hurting knows it was done with extreme hatred, there's a, something horrible that you feel, and karma is like that. The same goes for love, right? Like in other words, and that's true, isn't it? If you think of your own, I'm just kind of going off in that moment, right? If you think of your own experience, isn't that true? Like, in other words, if somebody did something nice for you, you value it. But if you think of the person who you felt loved you the most ever in your life, right? And when they did something for you, and the like love and the joy on their face that they were even getting, like where the person felt so happy to get to do that because they loved you that much, that it was like, this is their favorite thing the whole year, that they're getting to do this for you, right? You feel that there's more power in that, isn't there? And they felt it too. And the point is so karma is mainly created by the mind, right? So then what the teachings on karma say is, this practice of rejoicing actually, you create karma by rejoicing. And they give examples of positive, and that's true positive and negative. So sometimes the teachers say this, like they say, it's really easy to create a lot of bad karma by rejoicing. So for example, if you're watching the news, they often give this example, right? If you're watching the news and you see like, you know, you see people who you think of as on your side, killing people who you think of as not on your side, right? Bombing them or, you know, something like that. And you feel, oh, that's great, they got him, you know, and like you feel really happy, right? Meanwhile, of course, I've said this once before, like, meanwhile, what's happening, right, is that one person is killing somebody else, right, and the other person is dying, right, and then their parents, their children, are suffering terribly, right? And if you're feeling joy in that, you're actually creating a lot of negative karma, right? Because you're sort of participating mentally in that, and karma is mainly mental. That's the idea. So, in that way, you actually, you know, you could create it's actually easy to create extensive negative karma. Right? If you just watch the news, you know, and you feel really happy every time you see things like that, right? It would be like a negative meditation. It's the opposite of meditation or something like that. It's a way of cultivating negativity. And actually you do that, right? Or even, it could, I mean, that's killing, right? It could even be, you know, if you watch the political, and then let's say you watch politics, whichever side you don't like, when something bad happens to them, it's really hard not to think, oh, good, you know, I don't like that person, good. You know, they said something stupid or they lost something, or, right? You're actually rejoicing though in somebody else's suffering, right? Which is different than disagreeing with them. That's just to differentiate. Right? It's one thing to disagree with somebody and have your own moral stand on an issue. That's not this. But this is like rejoicing in their misery, right? That's never a positive thing. But it's easy to do in like all different areas, right? Like, at work, you know, if you don't like a person, I think it's something that's easy to do. If you're, you know, it's easy to do it with anybody who you think, I don't like them, right? All from a coworker to those bigger, you know, political figures, all the way to nations, actually, right? Like, so like if a nation has a horrible thing happen to it, those are real human beings, right? And feeling joy in that is horrible. You know? But actually, so think about it. How easy is it to feel that, right? It's really easy, isn't it? There's like actually millions of people feel that at one time sometimes over an issue, right? And actually, and then of course, actually what happens, right? If like this happens now, I'm just making a commentary on rejoicing, negative rejoicing for a second. That really does happen, doesn't it? Where like, so if something bad happens, let's say there's a nation that the U.S. doesn't, many people in the U.S. don't like, right? Then something bad happens there, people are happy, right? Then if something bad happens in the U.S. and people in that nation are shown rejoicing, then Americans get angry at that, right? But it's the same thing. Whereas rejoicing in suffering is never a positive. In other suffering is never a good idea. It's never a positive karma. It's actually mean-spirited, isn't it? And it's a negative karma. But anyway, so in this case, what we're doing is cultivating the opposite of that, still cultivating joy and rejoicing, but we're training our mind to cultivate joy and positivity. And I want to say a couple things about it. One is that it said that that's a way to create massive positive karma very easily. The second is that if you do that, I'm just making like a little bit of a comment here, if you actually notice your own experience, if you start feeling joy in that, what are you going to do, right? Whereas if you really cultivate joy in other people's positive actions and your own positive actions, and you habituate yourself to that, first of all, it's easier to feel joy. Secondly, they say this, it cuts through any habit of jealousy. Thirdly, though, and maybe most importantly, it creates the habit of feeling joy in good things, which makes you want to do them more. Right? So it actually makes you enthusiastic to do positive. So if you rejoice in love, for example, right, then your mind is going to naturally habituate itself and be drawn towards being loving or compassionate, for example. And the opposite is true too, if you really check. Actually, if you watch people, right, like people who rejoice in people hurting each other, their anger increases, right? So anyway, the idea here is we also, it makes the karmic imprint to develop those qualities. So even if you rejoice in others' good deeds, it habituates you to wanting to do those similar kinds of things. Does that make sense? So rejoicing has a lot of benefits. I also personally, this is my own personal comment, I also personally think it increases one's self-esteem. They don't use that term in Tibetan, but and so the idea, last thing I'll say, so the idea would be, like, you know, if you just say the verse, if we're like, let's say you're in a group doing a prayer, you might just say a verse. But really the idea would be like, this is an easy practice to do. So you would just like hang out and you would think, like, you might think about like all the people you know of in the world who are doing good things. And just think, how wonderful that is. Like, and you could think of like all different, you know, so here they give examples, right? I mean, so if you're meditating and you're visualizing the merit field that we talked about with all these different figures, the Buddha, and, you know, there's like Manjushri and Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti and all those masters. Well, then you might rejoice in their good deeds, right? Which is very inspiring. But also you can think of, right, like people from all different, you know, people who work in, I mean, whether it's from different religious traditions, whether it's, you know, secular, like people who work in NGOs in various places who are sincerely trying to help people, people who are volunteering to help people, people who are being kind to, you know, to strangers, people who are helping their neighbors, people who are helping those in disaster areas, you know, all those different examples you would just sit and contemplate until you really start to feel the beauty of that, the joy of that, the wonder of that, the positivity of that. Does that make sense? So that's that practice, rejoicing. And so you do that as a preliminary to meditation, but you can also do that anytime. You know, so it's a good thing to do at any point. And also if you see people doing things, just to rejoice, right? When you go around and if you see people doing positive things, then you pause and just think, you know, you would pause, you get in the habit of this, right? You would pause and think, wow, that's great. That's wonderful. Okay, so that's, then the next limb, right, of these 7 limbs is requesting the wheel of Dharma to be turned. And I'll just read the verse here. You who are the lights of the worlds in the 10 directions, who by means of the stages of enlightenment attained unimpeded Buddhahood, I exhort all of you, my saviors, to turn the unsurpassable wheel, meaning the wheel of Dharma. And the idea here is a couple things. One is, it's said that the Buddhas won't teach unless asked. Because, you know, actually in the world you see that Buddhism is not a, it's not a tradition that proselytizes. And the Dalai Lama, actually, that was one of the first things I really liked when I went to see the Dalai Lama was he said, he's only religious leader, where he's like, he's coming from the Buddhist tradition, right? And he says, it was like in a huge audiences in the West. He often says this, right? So you'd be in a huge place with like, you know, so many people come to see the Dalai Lama, and they'll say, don't become Buddhist. And he said, I'm not here to tell you to become Buddhist. I discourage you actually from becoming Buddhist. If you can't help it, then fine, you're allowed to, but I don't really encourage it. Which is like, really? Like, wow, that's so cool. I couldn't help it, obviously. Sometimes he tells that story. He's told that story many times of a Tibetan lady he knew who had, he said he knew a Tibetan lady who had been helped very much by Christian missionaries in India. And so she had converted to, she said she converted to Christianity, and then she came to the Dalai Lama and she said, Your Holiness Dalai Lama, I'm so sorry I had to convert to Christianity because they were so nice to me. But in my next lifetime, I'll be a Buddhist. And I was like, now you're not a good Buddhist or a good Christian, you know, because Christians don't believe in the next lifetime you can be a Buddhist. He said, so now you're really mixed up. And he said, so don't be, he said, so for Westerners, don't be like that. Don't confuse your, he was like, I'm not encouraging you to become Buddhist because it may confuse you, right? And like you may end up with a mixed idea like that. He said, so don't do that. He said, take what, and he says, right, take whatever is useful to you from Buddhism, and that's fine, and practice your own tradition. But anyway, so Buddhism's not that kind of tradition. And actually, historically, often on this verse, they often comment this story that when the Buddha achieved enlightenment in India, over 2,500 years ago, under the Bodhi tree, that that the Buddha thought, like they say that the Buddha had some kind of thought, like maybe I should, like this doctrine, the truth, in other words, that I've realized in meditation is so difficult, maybe I shouldn't teach it. Maybe people won't be able to understand or appreciate it. And the story goes that then Brahma, right, the god Brahma from the Brahma heaven in India, not in India, but who was familiar to India, in the Indian tradition, came down from the Brahma heaven and had a golden wheel, symbolic of turning the wheel of Dharma, the doctrine, the wheel of the teachings. And that the Brahma himself said, I offer this to you with the request that you teach what you've realized. And the Buddha kind of said, well, if I'm requested, then something like that. So the idea is that, and we said that earlier in here, in this text actually, that traditionally a teacher wouldn't teach unless requested. Like even in modern times, right? Teachers don't teach unless requested. So the idea here is that we create the, by requesting, right? It's like we're creating the cause for the Buddhas to teach. That's one. The other is that they say actually you're creating a kind of karmic, karmic seed to your teachings. Right? And actually that's true, isn't it? In other words, if you keep requesting, if you're like visualizing the Buddhas and requesting, then then if it's only the Dalai Lama or Lama Zopa come to town, of course you go because you've been requesting so much that then you think, oh, otherwise you may think, oh well, we'll go. So it does create a kind of karmic tendency, right, to hear teachings. And my own comment on that one is, so you can think of all the Buddhas. You can also request, if you're visualizing like your teachers, you can request to them. You can request to teach whatever is most beneficial. If there are particular topics you want to study, you can request teachings on that. And it's all of that is creating a karmic tendency. The next limb is supplication, they call it. And again, I'll just read the verse. Those who intend to show how to pass beyond sorrow, with folded hands I supplicate you to remain, for eons equaling the particles of all the universes, for the benefit and happiness of all migrating beings. And so this one is, here one is requesting the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and teachers to live long. Again, there was some story from the time of the Buddha that the Buddha said something like, that there would be a dependent relationship, a karmic, kind of an interdependence, that there would be something beneficial in requesting teachers to live longer. I think somebody didn't ask him, and then he didn't, and then he could have lived longer, but didn't. It's kind of karmic story like that. But anyway, it's said to be a positive karmic action to sort of pray for the long life of spiritual teachers. They also say that it actually creates a karmic tendency to lengthen your own life to request that. And then the final of these 7 limbs is dedication. And so the verse says, whatever slight virtue I have accumulated by prostrating, offering, and confessing, rejoicing, exhorting, and supplicating, I dedicate to the great enlightenment. Now there it's actually reviewing all 7 limbs, this verse, right? It's saying whatever merit I've created or positive karma I've created by all these other practices, I dedicate to enlightenment. And at this point, we should comment a little bit on dedication. Actually, in Buddhism, there are various different kinds of, or versions of prayer. Sometimes people ask about that, do Buddhists pray? And there are actually various kinds of prayer in Buddhism. Like, so, one is sort of just, one is sort of aspirational prayers, like, may I be able to be of benefit to all beings, something like that, right? May I be able to help others, may I be able to, whatever. Then there are just general prayers, like, may everyone be happy. But dedication prayers are said to be particularly powerful. And the idea of a dedication prayer is this, is that when you do a positive action, right, like this is getting into the dynamics of karma in a way, that when you do a positive action, right, you create some kind of positive energy, some positive imprint, some positive karmic seed, let's say. But then how that what will happen with that positive karmic seed depends upon your dedication. And actually, Khenpo Rinpoche in The Easy Path gives a funny analogy of that. He says, positive karma is rare and hard to create, and it's like gold. He uses the metaphor. Then he says, so having created this thing like gold, he says it's like, he says it's like raw gold, or like gold from the earth. And then he says, then how you dedicate determines what you do with that gold. And he says, so with a lump of gold, he said, you can either, he makes a joke at it, he says, you can either create like a beautiful Buddha statue, you can create jewelry, or you can make a golden toilet. And he says, golden toilet is not really that good an idea, basically. And it's a metaphor, obviously, but the idea is, again, what's this? Buddhism is very psychological, right? Everything is created by everything starts with your mind. Right? All your experiences, in other words, all your experiences of reality begin with your mind. And so the idea here is that, again, it's mental, right? So if you create a positive, and actually this is, if you look at, so this is the idea really, is you create this positive karma, this positive energy. And then or this positive seed or something. And then many times people, without realizing it, just their implicit prayer is like, may I be wealthy, or may I be popular, or may somebody like me, or something like that. And that's a really small result, And your mind is actually, if that's where your mind is at, our minds, us, me too, like, our minds are very narrow then. Does that make sense? Like, it's very small, actually. And the idea of training our mind in dedication and doing the practice of dedication is, actually, there's another, I'll give one more analogy that I like. There was somebody who said, I just thought the story was funny. It was some story, I guess, from Japan or somewhere like that, where somebody had incense and they were offering incense, and they liked their Buddha statue very much. So they only wanted to offer the incense to their Buddha statues. So they created like a cone going to their Buddha statue's face. They were like, I don't want to offer to the other Buddha statues. So they would hold their incense. And of course, eventually their Buddha statue became all completely dark and sooty and covered in soot. The other Buddha statues were still quite shiny and, which was, I thought, a nice metaphor. I don't know if it's a true story or not. That when we dedicate in this narrow way, or when our mind is sort of directed in a very narrow way, the results are kind of contaminated. The results are not extensive and are not very beautiful. The idea there. And it said, so for example, like, so if you do a positive action and your only sort of wish, some people might actually pray it, or if that's just what's in your mind. It's just like, may I, actually, I'll share, I'm on a mood of stories. Do you mind if I share one more story? This story also made me laugh when sharing them. It was actually a Lama from Bhutan told me this story, which I thought was very funny. He was doing a retreat. This Lama was doing, and this particular retreat, the ultimate goal would be to receive a vision of the deity. And some deities in Tibetan Buddhism are quite like wrathful looking, fire and all that. So he was doing a retreat like that, and the idea was like that you receive a vision of the deity, and then you sort of become enlightened. And so this guy was working really hard in his retreat, and then suddenly he was like praying or something, and suddenly the deity appeared there, but it appeared like the size of 3 buildings, like on fire, and said like, "What do you want?" And the guy was so freaked out, he looked up and said, "I don't want to die." And the guy said, "All right, you won't die soon." And then the deity disappeared. and he was like, "Wait, no, that wasn't like he was like, "You'll have a long life, fine," and disappeared. And the guy was like, "Oh, that wasn't the purpose of this retreat. It was something more. It was enlightened for others, and the ability to be a benefit, and the ability to have insights." And in that moment, his small-minded part had come out. And so this Lama said to me, "So if you're ever doing a retreat, remember, ask for something better than that." which was getting at the similar, it wasn't exactly the same point, but it's a similar point. Anyway, the idea is that when you create positive karma by doing something like these 7 limbs, okay, then, actually really the Buddhist idea is this, is ideally you would dedicate it to something that's infinite. And because then it never finishes ripening, is the idea. But if it's going to be infinite, it can't be only for yourself. That's the and of course there's a basic Buddhist psychological insight underlying this, which is, you know, when you dedicate your heart to everyone, you yourself also benefit. When you dedicate your heart only to yourself, others don't benefit, and you also don't benefit, is the problem. And so in dedication, there are many different forms of dedication, right? Here it says, I dedicate all of it to the great enlightenment, right? So there it's saying, this verse is saying, I dedicate my merits to the achievement of Buddhahood, which is an infinite state of infinite compassion and infinite wisdom for the welfare of infinite sentient beings, so that's infinite. Anyway, so that's what I mean is dedication with bodhicitta, right? So, you know, so one form of dedication is like that, right? Dedicating, may I become enlightened fully enlightened for the welfare of all beings. And there are many other kinds of dedication. There are many other beautiful dedication verses, right? You know, another one that's very famous, right, is the supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Or it has arisen, may it not decrease. Or it doesn't decrease, may it increase more and more. Right? Bodhicitta is the wish to achieve enlightenment for all beings, right? So that's, I mean, there you're wishing, may all beings achieve bodhicitta, right? And may their bodhicitta never decrease but increase. So essentially that's wishing for all beings to become enlightened, right? You know, then there are some verses like, where it's sort of saying, I'm not yet really capable, I almost take it as like, I'm not yet capable of really having that vast a thought, so you dedicate it. So this verse is like, just as the supreme bodhisattvas like Manjushri and Samantabhadra dedicated, I dedicate as they do. It's sort of saying, they have infinite dedication, I'm not quite there yet, so I dedicate that I may be like them, and dedicate like them. You know, so there are different ways of doing dedication. But here it says, all the roots of virtue from the previous 6 limbs are made the common property of all sentient beings and never come to an end by dedicating them with strong determination to complete enlightenment. Right, so it's also, you're essentially giving your good karma to others. It's also a form of generosity. And the last thing I'll say, it doesn't say it in this verse, is there's also said to be great benefit in dedicating with an awareness of emptiness, which we'll cover emptiness more in detail later in the text, but with an understanding, you know, of the lack of independent existence of the self, of the merit, of the act of dedication, right? That all those things don't exist independently or inherently from their own side, separate from dependent origination. So dedicating with that kind of awareness also is said to be very beneficial. Okay, so that's the 7 limbs. And then I'll just briefly kind of go through this. So then it says, if you understand the meaning of these words, actually this is a nice, he says, if you thus develop an understanding in the meaning of these words and gently do as was taught, without allowing your mind to wander, you will hold immeasurable heaps of merit. Right, and so what Lama Tsongkhapa is describing there is how to practice this, right? And I think it's interesting, right? He's saying gently on the one hand, right? Not pushing yourself and not being overly tight, right? But also not allowing your mind to drift away, right? So there's no better, if you just say words, right? If you just read words of a prayer and your mind's not on it, that's not going to work. On the other hand, he's saying, be gentle with your mind, right? Like Lama Yeshe someone said, the mind is organic. You have to work with it in an organic way, right? It's natural. And so so he's saying how to practice this, right? And he's saying, and if you do that, then you'll accumulate vast merit, right? Heaps of that, immeasurable heaps of merit. And then he explains a little more about why, you know, what the meaning, or how you do, what the meaning or benefits are in this next part. So I'll just describe that. So what he says is 5 of the limbs out of the 7, right, are for accumulating merit. Merit means like what? Virtue, positive karma, something like that. So that's prostrating, making offerings, requesting teachings, and requesting the teachers not to pass away, and also rejoicing. So those 5 are ways of creating Vasanar. Then the one called either purification or confession, however you want to translate that, that's not for accumulating merit, that's for purifying our negative tendencies. Then he says something else. He says, and then also rejoicing, not only is it for creating merit, but it also increases merits. And that said, like in other words, if you do a positive action and then you rejoice in that action, it makes the virtue or the merit more powerful or vaster. And then he says, so then based on those things, then if you dedicate, then the result will be inexhaustible, right? Which means it will go towards enlightenment, not towards some lesser goal. Now, before we go to the next thing here, I wanted to mention something, which is, so Lama Tsongkhapa in this text goes through, the preliminaries that we already talked about, and then the 7 limbs, and then he comes to the mandala offering, which is next. In other texts, I guess as sort of connected to this thing of dedication and supplication, they add in other kinds of prayers, which are optional. And I guess it comes under the supplication. So usually it comes right around the time of the mandala offering. Sometimes right before it and sometimes right after. I'll just mention, actually, and part of that is that Lama Tsongkhapa, this was a text, the middle-length Lam Rim, that Lama Tsongkhapa wrote. In the oral tradition that came down from Lama Tsongkhapa, there were supplementary or additional things that one could do. I'll just read, they're described in the Easy Path, so I'll just mention them. He said, Khenchen Rinpoche here says, there are 4 kinds of supplications here that you can add or make. One is called the prayer of the 3 great purposes. Another is the prayer for opening the door of supreme fields, the prayer of heaps of blessings, and the planting the stake prayer. Since it's not in the middle length Lam Rim, I think I won't go into detail about those, but I want to at least mention that you can add those in. If you're actually doing the preliminary practices, you can add in these additional prayers at this point. And they're quite powerful, so it's up to you, right? Okay, so that can be added there.
Question, please. The 3 words, offer mandala, that's a big thing. Is that covered later in the course, or?
Actually,
ask about it?
Yeah, no, well, let's talk about it here a little bit. And then, so it says here, offer a mandala with strong aspiration, right? And supplicate many times. I pray that all mistaken attitudes towards spiritual teacher, such as disrespect, may cease, and that all non-mistaken attitudes towards him may come with ease. So that's that's a prayer at the end of the mandala dedication. So offering the mandala, let's talk about just a little bit there. So the idea, right, with offering a mandala, I didn't bring mine actually, but many times one has. Oh, there's one there.
You make it?
Yeah, or should we put it? We can put it here. Or do you want to? Actually, there's nothing. We can just put it there, maybe, because I'm not going to actually do it since there's nothing to put it on. It won't collapse.
Yeah, if I get it over there, I'll be really happy. Sticking.
So since Paul asked, let's talk about it a little bit. So, so mandala, right? Like actually, people who have, there are different meanings. First of all, of mandala, this term mandala. In Tibetan, the word for mandala is like kilkor, which means like core is like a wheel or surround, like and then so it actually means center and surrounding. So it's like a center and a surrounding part. I think Western, I think we're somewhat familiar with mandalas now, right? Because it was, I think in the West it wasn't familiar until Carl Jung wrote about them. He sort of was the first to introduce them extensively in the West by writing commentaries about mandalas. Partly from the Tibetan tradition and partly from also, he was interested in them in Chinese and Native American traditions and South American traditions. still pretty. So he kind of wrote some about that. But there are different meanings of mandala in Tibetan Buddhism. You know, and one meaning of mandalas, or one way that one meaning or one reference to the term mandalas in Tibetan Buddhism is sometimes one visualizes, and you see the sand paintings are like this. So, you know, many people have seen the sand paintings that the monks do. So that's different than this. Those are, sometimes they're done with sand, sometimes they're painted also. But those are like purified, those are like pure universes, visualization, you know, that one visualizes of deities. So a different, like Buddhas, kind of their perception, it's kind of a description of their perception of a pure universe. That's one meaning of mantra. This meaning is a little different, although it's similar in a way. So what it is actually is, one is, oh, there's the long one. Okay.
Are you looking for it?
I got two, I have the short and the long. I got both of them. It's in Tibetan, but not English.
105.
Oh, is there in English? Oh, it's different in different books. Actually, though, this is where there's, oh, there it is. There, minus 94. But
180.
anyway, in this practice of mandala offering, and the idea is sometimes you'll see actually where people will do a mudra, or sometimes people will use a plate. This is a plate where you would actually take all that stuff off of it, and then you sort of build that up. Where people who don't have one, or you're somewhere public, you know, then there's a mudra, again with a center. The two ring fingers are sort of forming the center, and then one that uses the four sort of sides are creating the other four parts. Right. So again, there's a center and surrounding. Anyway, or you can use that actual mandala set, which is better if you have that, and if you're really interested in doing this practice. But the idea, in essence, to put it simply, is it's a practice of imagination. Right? You can say visualization, right? Really, I mean, what's there? I don't know. Visualization and imagination, I think the same thing. This one's certainly imagination. So the idea here is that you're imagining a beautiful, pure universe, or planet or universe, either one. Should be universe, ideally. And then you're offering that to the Buddha, the Bodhisattvas, or to your teachers, or whoever. Like, you know, in other words, to the teacher, the Lama, the Buddha, the Bodhisattva. So that's really, to put it simply, that's what you're doing, right? You're imagining a pure universe and making an offering. I wasn't going to go into this much detail, but since you asked, I'll add one side comment that I liked, which was actually from Professor Bob Thurman at Columbia University. One thing he said was, he said, actually doing mandala offerings, he said, it's really like, it gives you peace of mind. And he said, because there's a recognition, actually, that, that's what he said, there's a recognition that if you look around, that we have no idea what we're doing with this planet, and that we're completely insane. You know, and then he said, so actually, like, thinking of enlightened beings and saying, I offer it to you, he said, then you can be like, oh, phew, you know, like, because clearly I don't have any wisdom at all, because we're not, you know, I as part of this group that are here on this planet right now are really messing up, so I give it to you to take care of. I think he's partly joking, but not entirely, sadly. Because actually what one is really in this, so anyway, what one does, there are different lengths of, there are different, sometimes they call them numbers of heaps. Anyway, there are different, like, they're all similar, but there are different, slightly different various visualizations one can do. Some are more extensive, some are shorter. None of them are incorrect, they're just different traditions, so it doesn't matter. You can choose for yourself which one. But if you have the mandala plate, you would take all that stuff off of it, right? And you would just have the base that's there, so the base has a flat bottom. And then you use either, what they say in the commentary, if you want to do this actual practice, since you asked, is they say buy one that's as nice as your means. So they point out in the commentary, they say, you know, in other words, if somebody's like actually Lama Tsongkhapa himself, you know, like Lama Tsongkhapa himself when he was like a, what's it called? There was a period where he was like a hermit living in strict retreat in the wilderness, right? And so he used a rock. And they say that he did so many mandala offerings that the rock became very smooth and his hand would sort of, you know, got, first it hurt and then I guess it calluses and so, you know, he just used the rock because that was what he had. But they say, but if you're really rich, then don't use the rock, buy something nice because it should reflect that you should feel generous. That's the idea. So whatever you have, that's what you use, you know. You know, so they're saying if you're like a poor, simple person, then use what you have. If you're wealthy, then buy a golden one, whatever, it's up to you. But do something so it feels generous, that's the idea. And then you can use grains, you can fill it with grains, or you can fill it with like jewels, or you can fill it with, you know, sometimes people buy like semi-precious stones, or whatever you want, you know. But you have to have stuff that fills it up. And then there's a practice where you sort of, first you wipe it, you kind of put the grains on it, and you wipe it at least 3 times, kind of going away from you. And that symbolizes purifying your mind. And then you wipe it at least 3 times, kind of going towards you, and that symbolizes receiving the blessings of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And then as you're doing, and then as you're sort of, you know, reading different verses, the shortest version of the mandala offering is, this ground anointed with perfume and strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, that's the central axle mountain of the universe in Buddhist and Hindu mythology. 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this is a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Then there are much longer ones where you imagine offering all different things, including, for example, different. Actually, one thing is like if you actually start studying the longer one, it is really grounded in. I mean, for example, they talk about. I'll give an example here. You offer things like the precious mountain, the wish-granting tree, the wish-granting cow, the unplowed harvest, wish-granting jewels, great treasure vases, you know, precious elephants. It's very grounded in Indian mythology. It's kind of comparable, I think, if you were going to look at Western mythology, you'd be offering like what, the Philosopher's Stone and the, you know, all those kind of, all those, you know, those kinds of mythological, whatever's most valuable. That's the idea. So it's really up to you, you know, which version you want to do. But anyway, so as you're reading that, what you do is you sort of, you're building up those levels. But with each thing you read, like, so Mount Meru, you would put you know, if it was grains, let's say, you would put that in the middle. And then it says like 4 continents, so you would put the 4 heaps around it. And then as you're reading these different things, you know, goddesses offering flowers and incense, you would be putting like, you know, you'd keep putting more grains or more jewels or whatever it would be. And you build up the entire, so that's how you build up that 3-tiered thing. Then you put the thing on top by the end. So you're doing that as you're reading it. Does that make sense? And then at the very end, you kind of, you're visualizing that as this beautiful universe filled with all kinds of beautiful, wondrous things, and then you offer it to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. That's the idea in general. I'll say another quick comment, like a couple things, like one is, in a sense, actually, you know, in a sense, Dr. Thurman's right, because what are you actually offering? You know, on the one hand, you're offering something imagined, right? But you're also offering your own perception, right? Your experience of the world. You know, your experience. You're offering that. They say also, like, we all have a kind of, you know, listen, there are things that are owned by individuals, and then there's a kind of shared karmic reality, like this. Nobody owns the sun. You know, so you can offer that. You can offer your experience of the sun, things like that. Ultimately, in a sense, also you're offering your own merit. And you can, and I guess what I wanted to say, a couple more things there. One is like also, it really, I mean, actually what Dr. Thurman said is true in a sense, that you also offer in a way, actually included in that, right, is your home, everything you're attached to, you can offer. Right? Which is actually relaxing. Right? It's like, oh, you know, because oftentimes we get like stressed out. And that's actually a Buddhist training, right, is to feel also that this world and even things I think I own are not mine. They're just temporarily around me to be of service and to do something positive with, but they're not really mine. It's actually true, right? I'm sure you've had that experience where you're like, you have something of somebody who's died, like the person died and you have their thing, right? And you're like, So this is there. You look at it and you go, oh, this was my grandfather's. Like, well, actually, you know, yeah, not anymore. And in a sense, like, from its own side, it was never. And it was, I mean, the object never was, from its own side, was never his or grandmother's. It was her, right? Like, they were associated with it for a little while. So, right? It exists, and the atoms in it existed before them. Will exist after. It's not really anybody's. Anyway, so one offers
Kids.
this kind of, what's that?
Kids.
Kids, yeah,
You
they're
think
not yours
they're
either.
not.
That's clear. But okay, so you offer that, and I'll make one more comment here. Like, again, what this offering of the mandala is getting at in part is that, remember, everything, karma mainly comes from the mind. Right? Remember this, like also we said this once, and we'll get into it more, and I've said this before, that like the perfection of generosity, which is one of the practices of Bodhisattva, the definition of having perfected generosity isn't that you've eliminated all the poverty in the world, because there's still poverty in the world and the Buddha became enlightened. The idea, the perfection of generosity is being willing, being happy to give away, what, like not feeling attached to anything. Being happy, is having a completely generous heart. Right? When somebody has that, when they're even happy, you know, the Bodhisattvas on the first bhumi perfect the practice of generosity, where they practice, like there's that famous story where the Bodhisattva, the future Buddha, gave away his body to the tigress, right, who was starving, and saved her and her cubs. Right? He was completing he was on the first bhumi then, he was completing the perfection of generosity. Anyway, the idea of generosity, the perfection of generosity, is that you're happy to give away everything. So you're training in that here, right? You're training in this joy in giving, in this sort of non-attachment, in this being willing to give away everything. So you can imagine giving away yourself, giving away your house, giving away your merit, giving away the whole universe. Right? In this case, you're imagining giving that to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, your teachers. Okay, and then you can do those, if you want, in this point, you can do those supplementary or extra prayers, or practice, you have prayers too. And then I want to cover one more part here, and then we can have some discussion. Or actually, any other questions first? Okay, so I'll cover this next part, because then I think it's going to lead to a discussion about the future classes and what we're going to do with them. So Lama Tsongkhapa next says how to how to meditate. He now brings up this whole, so these are all the preliminaries, right? Now he's saying, okay, I've taught you the preliminaries, how to organize a session, how to sit, you know, how to what posture, and so on. Now, how do you actually practice, right? How do you do all of this? And so obviously he's already said, you know, you do the preliminaries, right? But he's saying, meditation on the path, as will be explained here, serves to make you fit to utilize any virtuous object you wish. Moreover, if you attend to this and that observed object without the thought to merely take this number of observed, and anyway, so what he's saying here, I'll kind of want to, this is a very important point for actual practice. So, a couple things Lama Tsongkhapa gets into in these next few sections. One is, there are two types of meditation. And His Holiness Dalai Lama often talks about this. So there's analytical meditation and fixed or single-pointed meditation. And what the Dalai Lama says is both are important, but analytical meditation is more important. And what those are, right? Analytical meditation is where you take a certain topic and you analyze it, right? Using reasons, using imagination, using scripture, using your own experience, using the experiences you observed of others, and fitting all of that into a kind of sequenced reasoning process. So that's analytical meditation, or an analysis of something. The other kind of meditation is fixed. That's where, or single-pointed. That's where you choose one object. You're not analyzing it, or you may analyze it at first, but you don't stay in analysis. You have to stop analyzing, and you just focus your mind single-pointedly on that object. And sometimes in the West, people think that only fixed meditation is meditation. Some people have said that to me, so that's why I know some people think that. The Dalai Lama says, clearly, they're both important, but analytical meditation is the more important of the two. And he says that, and also he says, he points out that anybody who's going to become enlightened has to do both kinds of meditation. If you want to progress towards enlightenment, you have to practice both of those. If you look at the stages of the path to enlightenment, this tradition, right, the Lamrim, the stages of the path, you'll see that the majority of the meditation topics require a fair amount of analysis, analytical meditation. And then the single point meditation is also taught in great detail in this. So they're all taught here. But the majority of the topics involve a certain amount of analytical meditation. So now, what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here is this, is regarding analytical meditation, he's saying, if you just think about whatever you want, that's not analytical meditation. If you, let's say this, if you sort of study this text, right, and then you just sort of haphazardly jump around and think, well, I feel like thinking about this a little bit now. I'll think of the 1 point out of the 7 on this topic. And then, oh, wow, that's interesting over there. Or I'll think of the 4th point on that topic. He says, then what does he say here? He says, nothing will come of it. He says, you're not going to get anywhere at all if that's what you do. And then he says, and if you start off that way, he says, having gone wrong from the beginning, your spiritual practice will continue to be faulty throughout your life. You can correct it if you do that. But what he's saying is, if you take that kind of approach where you don't systematically engage in the analysis when you're doing analytical meditation, nothing's really going to happen. Your spiritual life, it'd be, actually I want to draw an analogy, a metaphor for a minute. It'd be like if you, I'm just going to say this, like if you wanted to cook, Thanksgiving dinner, right? And so you put your turkey in the oven, and you turned it on, and then 5 minutes later you turned the oven off and took the turkey out, and put some water up to boil, right, to make like mashed potatoes, and then you turned that off and thought, oh, I'll put the turkey back in, but you didn't turn the oven on, and then you like took out the stuffing, but didn't really do anything with it, and then you put the turkey back in the fridge, you know, like Thanksgiving would come and go and everybody would be really hungry, you know. It's a little like that. In other words, if you don't approach these analytical meditations in a way that creates some heat, that like turns up the heat, you know, that changes you, you know, transform. I mean, I'm giving a metaphor of cooking, right? It transforms your mind, right? Like actually brings about some kind of transformation. That requires deep analysis and deep thought and sort of deeply engaging. And then what happens, this is important, because what happens is this, is the idea of these analytical meditations is that, first of all, you have to understand, what am I analyzing? What are the parts of the analysis? And then you have to relate it to various things, scripture, experience, reason, observation, and so on, until you, and then if it's working, what happens is a few things. One is, with many of these meditations, what happens is that you eventually come to a point, you know, first you've heard about something from somebody else, right? You've read in a book, or you've heard a teaching, but with not all the meditations, some of the meditations, the goal is that there comes a point where you have an actual realization of it yourself in your own contemplative or analytical meditation. That's quite powerful. And that's what starts to transform. The other is also through these analytical meditations is that you also, some of the other ones like compassion, you also habituate your mind to that. Does that make sense? And your mind becomes deeply infused with that. So in some cases it's that you realize the topic, like it's like like impermanence, for example. There comes a point where you have a kind of realization of your own impermanence. That's not intellectual, but it's experiential. But it's through an analytical meditation. There are others, like let's say compassion or faith, where it's not, you don't realize faith or you don't realize compassion, but you infuse your mind with it, and your mind becomes very familiar with that state. Does that make sense? Until that state becomes like your new baseline, actually. So that can happen with compassion, for example, or bodhicitta. So the real point here is, if you're going to do analytical meditation, which is many of these, and the same actually applies, to be honest, to fixed or single-pointed meditation. You know, if you don't, or is again the same thing, they say that in the teaching on it. Whereas if you pick one object for a single-pointed meditation, and you do that for a little while, like a couple days, and then you think, oh, that was kind of hard, I'll switch to this object, oh, I'll switch to that object, now I feel like maybe I'll do analytical meditation because that was tiring or something. Then again, like there are 9 levels of single-pointed concentration that a trained person goes through before they achieve calm abiding, which is the goal of that. And well, if you do that, you'll never get past the second, you know, you'll just keep staying at the first and second level. You'll never progress to the higher levels of concentration unless you pick one object and you really stick with it and develop deep concentration. So what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here, right, is that you know, so this is how to practice, right? Is that you know, so you pick a subject, right, from, you know, in order, you know, in the Lam Rim, and you deeply engage with it until you start to transform. What Lama Tsongkhapa gets at next, and I want to say a little about, so now he gives an example where he says, okay, so I just said, Lama Tsongkhapa is basically saying, I just said, don't just let your mind jump around to different things. If you can do analytical meditation, really know the sequence, know the parts of the analytical meditation, you know, and do it systematically and completely, right? So now he gives an example. He says, so, basically, if we just covered this topic, the previous topic right before the preliminaries was how to rely upon a spiritual teacher. And he says, so here's how you do that. First, think about the benefits of reliance and about the faults of non-reliance. Then repeatedly resolve, you know, and so on. And so what he's going through is how to systematically do that. In other words, that you go step by step through the sequence of those meditations. And it's almost like, you know, as I say it, like a workout or something. It's like, you know, you do it in order, you know what the order is. And one thing that Khenso Rinpoche pointed out when teaching about this, which is in line exactly with what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, is, you know, so if you're going to do that on a particular topic, right, like let's say whether it's precious human rebirth or impermanence or reliance on the spiritual teacher, right, then what that means actually, right, and is that you have to know that topic well, right, like, and so I'll be honest, like you know, actually, actually I remember this, like, people have pointed this out even, like, I'm trying to say it the right way, okay, so like if you say I'm meditating on reliance on the spiritual teacher, right? And then if I say to you, okay, well, what are the steps of that? And you say, I don't know, like this, and then somewhere, if I don't remember the order, you know, then you're not doing it right. Does that make sense? That's what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, right? Whereas, and Khenso Rinpoche said, right? Like, in other words, you have to, he actually said this, he said, if you're serious about a particular topic, then you memorize the outline of that topic at least. And maybe some of the quotes, you know, some of the relevant, you don't have to, it's not that you memorize the whole book necessarily, although he probably, I think he did. But you actually, you know, as you know what those things are, you can do them forward, you can do them backward, you know, as you really know that well, because it's what you're meditating on. Does that make sense? And if you're meditating every day on that for a while to try to get a real experience, how would you do that if you don't know what the topic really is? Does that make sense? So that's part of the difference. So let's actually go through this now, right? So if you're like, this is part of the difference between the you know, the wisdom of listening, right? They talk about the wisdom of listening, the wisdom of contemplating or analysis, and the wisdom of meditation. Right? So the wisdom of listening, right, is really just this first, is the first step where you kind of listen and you kind of say, oh, that's what that is. Okay, I understand, and you kind of get a general idea, right? But then the wisdom of analysis, the first step to get that is you have to like really kind of sit down and say, this is still like, actually this is still the wisdom of listening, really, is you sort of memorize what's the outline, what are the steps, you know, what's this process, right? And I just want to point something out, like, that's how it is in anything, right? Like, there is, you know, like, if somebody says they know how to cook a particular dish very well, right? Well, then they know, right? They memorize how to make that particular thing, you know? And if you're in your job, right, there might be things you do rarely you have to look up, right? But the stuff you're really good at, you know how to do it. Mike's a pilot, right? Like, if we said, oh, like, if we said, oh, you know, let's turn that way, and he said, oh, let me get my manual to figure out how to do that, you wouldn't want to be in the plane with him, right? Like, it wouldn't be very good. I mean, he knows how, you know, he knows how to take off and land without reading the book about how to land, right? That'd be really dangerous, right? Oh, we're up in the sky, I don't know how to land, I better get the manual out. That's not a good sign, I would think. You're the pilot, right? Am I correct on that? Your meditation, you should know at least that well. Does that make sense? Like, so there's like, that you should really know how to do a particular topic, right? And you know how to take off, you know how to get where you're going, and you know how to land. You know that topic completely. Does that make sense? You don't have to know the whole Lam Rim completely in that way yet. Once you've gone through the whole Lam Rim, you would, naturally. Right? But you have to, like, so you have to really get to know that topic. And then what does contemplation mean, actually, right? So it means that you, right, like, so, what should I say this? That having sort of gotten the outline, having understood the general points, right, then you start you start contemplating deeply. That's the better way to say it. You contemplate deeply on it, and you start relating it to your own experience. Does that make sense? I'm going to give an example. Like, one example in the Lam Rim, right, is one of the processes for generating bodhicitta, right, is this whole process where you generate equanimity, and then you equalize self and other, rather, and you know, so you sort of recognize an even-mindedness, and then you see the faults of self-centeredness, the advantages of cherishing others, right? Then you equalize and exchange self with other. You do Tonglen, taking and giving meditation, and eventually you develop bodhicitta. Like, so, let's say you know that sequence. I'm just using that example. Right? But then, when you're going through each point, right? So let's say the first point is equanimity. Right? So it says in a scripture, right? Everyone says things like this. Everyone is the same in wanting to be happy and not wanting to suffer. Right? So if you say, I know that it says that in a book, that, you know, that's listening. Right? Now you have to actually check, right? So you meditate and you say, like, you actually put yourself in other people's shoes and you say, like, wow, these people who I usually don't like, are they really like me or not? I don't think they're like me. Doesn't feel to me like they're like me. I feel like they're like some other kind of something. Right? Like, I don't really care about them, you know. And then you have to, you have to admit that to yourself, right? That's not in a book, right? It doesn't say that in the book, right? But that's what you have to do when you start contemplating. You start saying, so my attitude, is it realistic or is it unrealistic? Right? And you start going through it. Does that make sense? Or actually, I don't know why I jumped ahead. The example of the benefits of reliance and the faults of, right? So like one of the points we got to is the kindness. One of these points here was the kindness of your spiritual teacher. I'm just picking that as an example. Right? So you would contemplate on it, right? You would say, well, is my spirit, you know, are these spiritual teachers kind or not? Right? You'd actually have to let yourself notice, well, maybe I have doubts about that. Like they're not always doing what I want. They're not always giving me, like, I kind of wish they would, come around whenever I feel like it, or maybe they cook me dinner, I don't know, whatever, like, what's kindness to me, right? And then you have to actually analyze it. What does it mean that they're kind? And why does this, Vajradhara said this, or some other, like, there are different quotes, right? But then you have to contemplate and say, is that my experience? Is that reasonable? Does that make sense to me? In what way does that seem to be true? And you have to kind of analyze it for yourself until you start to get an experience. Then if there comes a point, right, where you feel like, as I say it, like an overwhelming experience of their kindness, right? Like where you suddenly as soon as you start like getting into that, you start like feeling overwhelmed or crying or just feeling like, wow, oh my God, like that's unbelievable. I get it now, right? Now it's not just the wisdom of listening, it's the wisdom that came from your own contemplation. Does that make sense? So they're two different things, right? And then meditation means familiarizing with that, right? So meditation means you familiarize with that again and again and again until you become, actually I remember I'll share that actually, so in that example, right? So at the beginning it's just something you read in a book, right? Then you contemplate it over and over again until you see if it's true, first of all, if you agree with it or not, and until then you start to get some experience. Then you familiarize your mind with that. That's meditation, right? Where you infuse your mind with that over and over until it becomes your baseline. Right? And I'll give an example on that topic, right? I remember like when I would be with Riba Rinpoche, who's passed away, who's one of Lama Zopa Rinpoche's teachers, and like where he couldn't even say the name of his root teacher was Pabonka Rinpoche, and he couldn't even say his name. Like he would get so choked up when he would try, that finally he would just say he would just say the Buddha. He would say like basically Buddha Vajradhara. He would say I can't. That's all I can say. He would say, you know who I mean, right? Because I can't. And like if somebody else mentioned the name, he would just start. You would see he would just get overwhelmed with like gratitude. His experience was immediate. It was because that was his baseline. Does that make sense? That was his, like in association to his teacher, right? He felt so much how his experience, clearly you could see it on his face, was like there's no, like it would be impossible for anyone to have been more kind to him, right? That's why I'm using that example of the kindness of the teacher, right? That he so felt the kindness that just the mention of that name or a picture, and he would like, you could see he was completely overwhelmed with love and gratitude and appreciation. And, that's from meditation. That's not, as we say it, that came from meditation. Does that make sense? From his having realized that point in meditation. Then he moves on from there. It's like, okay, he's realized that. Then that's when, Like, it was ideally, right, according to what Lama Tsongkhapa was saying, then you move on to the next topic. Right? And like precious human rebirth, right, is the next topic, right, in the Lam Rim. And there, like, it would be like, right, where the person, like, every morning wakes up. Remember, I always use this example because it's the one that, for me, it resonates. So, like, if you're, like, you know, when the person every morning when they wake up is like Scrooge waking up on Christmas morning after he thought he was dead, and they're like, remember, there's an old time actor who's like, I'm alive, and he's like leaping around. He's so excited to be alive that he can do something good and repair, you know, the life he lived, right? If you've realized precious human rebirth, right, every day you wake up and you're like, oh wow, I have the most valuable thing in the world, you know, like this is the most valuable thing in the whole universe, like, you feel like totally excited to be alive, right? When you reach that level where it's not just, they say like at the beginning, it's like, what's it say? At first you have no experience of the topic, right? It's just some like words, right? Then there comes a point where with effort you can get to the point of feeling it. Does that make sense? Like, because it's not our baseline. It's not, where our baseline is what? Is ignorance and craving and desire, or sometimes anger, occasionally pride distracts us from our desire or something. You know, that's our normal baseline, right? But the idea is at first there's no experience, therefore, of these topics, right? But then if you contemplate enough, there comes a point where, with effort, you can develop some feeling of the topic. Right? That's what they call, sometimes, what do they call it? There's a word for it. Like with bodhicitta, there's genuine bodhicitta, there's kind of like, artificial, contrived, that's the word, not artificial, contrived. And they say contrived is good, you know, that's part of the process. So first there's nothing, you know, like, so first there's, let's say, no appreciation of the preciousness of human life, right, of human rebirth. Then there's a contrived experience of it, which is a stepping stone along the way, and then eventually there comes an uncontrived experience, where it's your natural, you know, you see somebody who has a precious human rebirth and you think, oh wow, they're so lucky. You know, you immediately feel that, the way Rebbe Rinpoche was describing, like, it's just spontaneous, right? But that doesn't happen at the beginning. That happens through a process that Lama Tsongkhapa is describing, where then that becomes your norm, and then you go on to the next topic. And in that way, you eventually become a Buddha. Actually, that's the actual process. So now I want to go back to what Lama Tsongkhapa was saying, right? What he was saying is, if you just skip around and you think, oh yeah, that's an interesting topic, but you don't ever really get into it deeply, and you don't sort of go deeply into it, then in the end, you know, using my analogy for Pabongka Rinpoche, actually used the analogy where he says, then you become like a soup where nothing's cooked and everything's floating around, it's a bunch of vegetables floating around on the top, or something like that, and the soup doesn't taste good or something. The idea is like, you know, if you do this deeply, you actually transform. Does that make sense, kind of? And that's the way you transform, is by engaging deeply in each topic. So now Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, how do you do that, right? And so he goes through this part where he describes regarding the reliance on the spiritual teacher. He describes the steps, right, that you go through, and you contemplate those steps in order, and you eventually get this uncontrived experience like Rebbe Rinpoche got. We can get that too if we do the practice. Then he says what to do at the end of the meditation. So he says, so you do your preliminaries, right? And what he's getting at is this: there's a quote that Pabongka Rinpoche himself says, where he says, basically what he says is, if you actually do this, in other words, if you actually, like, you don't have to spend hours and hours, you know, every day meditating. What you have to do is when you meditate, is do it properly, you know, like do it professionally or do it correctly, in other words, so that you actually do the preliminaries, you actually meditate in the right way, in the right sequence, you actually, you know, and you actually infuse your mind and really engage deeply with it. And he says, and then at the end of the session, you dedicate, you know, you do your dedication of merit. And well, actually, there's this, so the Pabongka Rinpoche makes this point where he says, if you do that, he says, then there's a quote where he says something like, if, you know, then realizations that you thought you would never have gotten in hundreds of years can happen. That's the point. So anyway, okay, so then Lama Tsongkhapa, he's going through how to actually practice, right? So he says ideally you would do 4 sessions of meditation a day. That's the ideal. But then he says, don't make those meditation sessions very long. he actually says, if you make them very long, especially as a beginner, what's going to happen is, all you're going to familiarize yourself with is agitation, what he calls it, laxity and excitement. And so basically you're going to familiarize, instead of familiarizing yourself with the topics of meditation, what you're actually going to end up familiarizing your mind with is laxity, which is sort of a dull, sinking mind, or agitation and excitement, right? Where you're actually distracted to other things. So you're sitting, he says, then you become like somebody who, either you're, actually many of us are like this at times, we're like, actually your meditation is some combination of, I'm tired, I'm not falling asleep, or my mind's drifting away to all other topics, and every now and then I think of the topic I'm supposed to be meditating on. And he says, that's not transformative, right? So he says, better to do a really short session and concentrate very well during it. And he says, that's much more transformative. So if somebody says, oh, I did like 4 hours session of meditation, but if most of the time was spent either being tired or distracted, that's not that helpful. It's much more helpful. And as Helen Dalai Lama, in commenting on this verse, on this point, he says actually that he gives examples of people he knew who their meditation session, they did the preliminaries and they did 10 minutes of really good meditation and they stopped, and that was their meditation session. Well, first of all, then it's realistic. One could do 4 sessions a day, right? If they're not 2 hours each, if you're not in retreat. If you're in retreat, you can do long. But even in retreat, what the Dalai Lama was saying was, for beginners, it's not a good idea to do super long sessions. It's better to do many short sessions. If you're in retreat, you could do, whatever, 20, 10-minute sessions or something. That's fine. And he says here, Lama Tsongkhapa says, he says actually, if you do those long sessions, he says, and then you get in the habit of being sinking and lax and sort of lazy and tired, or overly excited and distracted, he says, then it's going to actually be very hard to correct that later. He says, so don't do that. From the beginning, do short sessions where you concentrate very well. Then he says, actually it's best to cut the sessions short when there's still a desire to keep meditating. And then you'll really want a meditation, to enter the meditation the next time. And then he says something funny. He says, they say that otherwise you'll be overcome by nausea at the sight of your meditation cushion, which I think is pretty fun. Right? And he's saying, if that's how you feel, then you've been meditating the wrong way, for sure. Whereas when you see your meditation cushion, what he's getting at is you should feel, not you should in the sense of like, should, but in the sense of if you're doing it right, then you're gonna feel, oh, cool, I get to meditate again. Like, this is my favorite thing in the day. Like, all that other stuff is like, okay, but this is my favorite thing. Does that make sense? Like, and that's really how it should feel. But there, can you imagine that? So you really have to do that, right? So you're meditating, and like, where you're feeling like a good meditation session, like, oh, I'd like to keep going, and you say, okay, no, time to stop. And then very slowly you can increase that. Does that make sense? And eventually you can do very long sessions, that's fine, but you have to only increase them very slowly so that you don't start to sink and be tired or feel distracted. So that's the way to build up a meditation practice. And yeah, he says that. He says, once your meditation is stabilized a bit, you should prolong the sessions, sustaining them all free from being excessively tense or excessively relaxed. Right? So in other words, don't meditate any longer than what you're capable of without getting really tense or getting too relaxed that you're either tired or distracted. So you have to know for yourself, right? Like, how long can I sustain it? I'll share one other experience actually. I was actually just talking to a friend not long ago, and I thought this was great. He was saying, like, because some people I knew who did like long retreats, then they would say, like, they actually had the experience more like what he was describing. I knew some people who did long retreats and had the experience similar to what he was describing of the nausea, where they did a long retreat and they were like, oh, I have to go back and meditate more. Oh. And this friend of mine who was telling me about his experience with retreat, I thought was perfect. Is what Lama Tsongkhapa was describing, where he said, like, he was like, oh, I was so excited to get there. He was saying he used to do martial arts, so that's right. He was like, it was like that. Like, I learned the form. It was like learning when Lama Tsongkhapa again. I learned like the sequence, and I was like so excited. Now I get to actually practice it, And he was like, and he did the sessions like he was describing. It was very, and was like creative and engaged with it. And he was like, it was so fun. It was so exciting, and like, that's how you should feel. That's my point. That's how if you say I'm going in retreat, right? It should be like if you're relating to it correctly, it would be like I don't know, the way somebody else might say they're going to the Caribbean or something, or when somebody says they just met a new boyfriend or girlfriend, like that kind of, when people's look on their face, if you're doing it right, it feels like that. So if it feels like, oh, the nausea thing, you're doing it wrong.
Not a good sign.
No. And then he said, and then the next thing Lama Tsongkhapa gets into about how to progress. This is like, so what he's getting at here is how to really make this transformative to your spirit, your mind, your heart. Is he gets into what to do between sessions. And Khenpo Rinpoche in his commentary and the other commentaries point out something, which is, for us, of course, it's funny that they call it what to do between meditation sessions, because for us, that's our life, right? Like, we call that life or something, I don't know, you know, like, but they're calling it what to do between meditation sessions. That's not what Khenpo Rinpoche said was, most of your life is spent between meditation sessions, so they're really important. That's a really important topic, because most, you know, for somebody who's spending, you know, eventually, like, is spending, whatever, many hours a day in meditation, then these brief times between their meditation sessions. But for us, oftentimes it's more. And so what Lama Tsongkhapa gets into here is a few things. One is he says, you know, in between meditation sessions, it's good to do other virtuous activities, right? Like, so, I mean, you know, he gives examples like making prostrations, circumambulating, reciting prayers, and so on, reciting sutras and studying texts. And then he says, particularly though, it's important if you're really working on a particular topic in meditation to keep that topic in mind between the sessions, and also to read, you know, read about that topic, or watch teachings, you know, you can download teachings or something, listen to teachings or watch teachings on that topic. And he says, and bring it to mind again and again. And the other thing is to, you know, accumulate good karma and avoid creating bad karma, and be mindful of your ethical behavior, because your meditation is not going to progress if you're not ethical. So he says here, your determination with respect to ethics you have accepted, the basis of everything should be reaffirmed a lot. Right? So he's getting at, you're not going to progress in meditation if you're not being a good, ethical human being. And then he gets into the causes of calm abiding and special insight. So calm abiding and special insight, right? Calm abiding is this state of mind, it's actually, really calm abiding is a state of mind where you have single-pointed concentration, combined with what they call physical and mental bliss and pliancy. It's like a flexibility where you can kind of, your mind and your body are able to apply themselves to whatever you want without too much effort, easily. But so what he's getting at, you know, and sort of so, and then combining that with insight, with special insight, where you have, you use this deep meditation to gain insight into a topic. So he's saying, how do you begin to progress towards that kind of state? Right, we're not going to get there immediately, but he's saying, and more later in the text, he'll describe in detail how you progress to calm abiding. But here he's saying, how do you begin? How do you begin to progress, right? And as you're meditating on these topics, and he goes through a few topics, which I think we can cover briefly. You know, so I'll just go through them briefly. One is, he says, controlling the 6 sense doors. And what he's getting at there is this: is that you know, actually, in Buddhist cosmology or something, they call the human realm part of the desire realm, right? Meaning that the beings in this realm, including humans and animals too, are mostly controlled by desire. And so what he's getting at here is he's saying, that's the nature of the realm we're in. And so he says, there are 6 sense doors, 6 doors of awareness, right? It means your eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. Right? Touch, and body meaning sense of touch, and mind. And so what he's saying here is, if you want to progress on the path, right? And if you want to progress, then he's saying, you have to, in daily life, in life, basically, be introspective and aware of what's going on with those. Because for the most part, it's with those that we develop first craving and desire and so on, and then when we don't get what we want, become angry, and we become jealous of other people who have what we think we want that they may have, and they're not satisfied, but that's a different issue. So the idea here is that we have to be, and he says, attachment and aversion end up arising towards the 6 pleasant and unpleasant objects of mental consciousness, right? So what he's getting at there is just we have to be aware of what's going on with, whereas where are our eyes, our ears, our nose, what's going on with those, and then in what way are we giving rise to afflictive states of mind. And what the Dalai Lama said in the commenting on this is, you know, that for us, in other words, for beginners, we have to do our best to avoid situations that are going to give rise to extreme negative, extreme emotional, those kind of emotions, right? And that's part of our training in a sense. And then if we're around those situations, we have to try to be introspective and mindful and aware and apply training to them. And that's where he says again. So then, introspective behavior is the second point. So he says, examine again and again the situation of body and mind. That is a sign, exactly that, of introspection. And so what he's getting at there, right, is that, you know, part of the training here is that you think before you do things, right? And that you try to avoid actions that are going to be harmful to yourself and others, and do actions that are going to be helpful to yourself and others. There's one verse by Atisha that says something like, when I'm around other people, be careful of what I say. When I'm alone, be careful of my mind. Which makes sense. Be careful of what your mind's doing, right? Because think about it, right? It's easy, like these practices like rejoicing. We can do that anytime, right? We can cultivate love or compassion or rejoicing anytime. But if what we're habituated to is easier, so it's easier to give rise to what? Attachment or aversion, anger, craving. Those are easier to give rise to. It takes more, because they're more familiar. But if we do that, then we're going to forever be familiar with those. So he's saying, guard your mind, right? Like, direct your mind towards something positive. Then he says the right measure of food. Here, there's a couple things they're getting at. One is actually in the, Kensho goes into more detail in the Easy Path, but one point is, you know, if you're trying to develop deep concentration, if you eat too little, you don't have the energy. And if you eat too much, it makes you tired, and so it's hard to meditate deeply. That's one. The other that he's getting at here is, which also Kensho explains more in that, more than is in here. But is this idea also of relating to eating as a form, like, because really it's this, it's training oneself, training the mind to relate to eating in terms of as a practice, as a spiritual practice, rather than as a, so Papa says here, rather than as a form of cultivating desire. And what he's talking about in a way is that he actually gives examples, right? He says, remember what it said about eating and think that it would be, so he's saying, one is he says, don't relate to eating through mental afflictions. That's the first point Lama Tsongkhapa makes. Then he advises, rather, it should be a benefit to the giver, right? So one thing he's saying there is to contemplate how many people helped you to have that food, right? Which is actually a very extensive topic, isn't it? Whereas if you actually contemplate that, right? I mean, it's limitless, really. I mean, you could say, I was about to say from the farmer, but actually, the farmers wouldn't have the seeds if the previous farmer hadn't planted seeds, and I wouldn't have if the previous, and it goes back a lot. You know, and then all the other intermediary steps, right, like transportation and so on. So when it talks about giver, it's talking about that, right, that all my happiness, everything I have is dependent upon others, right? That's what he's getting at. So eating with a sense of gratitude, right? And in some cases, of course, it's some creature gave their body for food as well, if we're not if we're eating meat. And then he says, also think of giving. He points out correctly, science says, knows this, and Lama Tsongkhapa points it out. Also that much of our digestive tract is made up of microorganisms. Right? That's what it says here. And think so. I'm also feeding them. That's what he's getting at. I'm not only feeding myself. I'm feeding a whole community, which is actually true. And then he thinks, and with the prayer or the thought, now I'm feeding all those. Actually, I guess it's millions, right? Millions of microorganisms as I feed myself. In the future, may I be able to feed them the gift of Dharma. Give them the gift of the Dharma. And basically what he's getting at is is to relate to, really, it's to relate to the act of eating with through compassion. Right? So compassion for others who have given, and then also with a sense of, as I say, wishing to sustain ourselves, to make use of our life, and so on. You know, then there are other verses, you know, for offering food, and you can choose your favorite one. Basically, there are all different kinds of versions in Buddhism, actually, of offering verses for food. Choose whichever one you like, and you can practice that. And the last point I'll cover for today, because this sort of finishes this this topic, is sleep. And so, you know, I won't go into great detail. What I'll just say about that point, you can read it if you want, but what I'll say in brief about that is, in Buddhist psychology, there are like, in the Buddhist psychological texts, there are certain states of mind, like compassion, for example, or love, they're by nature positive. There are other states of mind that are by nature negative, like hatred, right, or jealousy, or so on. And then there are what they're called changeable mental states. Mental states that can be either positive or negative depending on the motivation and the person. Like, so, that are not inherently by their nature good or bad. Does that make sense? Or healthy or unhealthy?
Neutral?
Neutral. Well, actually, it's different than neutral. It's changeable in the sense that you can turn it into a positive or a negative. It's not, because neutral would imply that it's always neutral, but sleep is not always neutral. It can be a neutral karma, or positive, or negative, depending on you. And what he's saying is, turn sleep into a positive here. And so, like, sometimes, like, actually, because you can see how sleep is sometimes a negative, actually. Like, what that would be is like, I'll give an example of that, right? It's common. Like, where sleep becomes a kind of negative is like where, as I say, if you're living in a way where you don't like life, actually, right? And then, like, you're just yearning for oblivion, basically. So there's this, like, craving of, like, I just want to sleep so I can escape into in nothingness or something. That's actually an unhealthy state. You know, it's not a healthy thing, right? It's a kind of craving for nothingness, which is actually makes the mind unhappy. By nature, it's an unhappy state of mind, and it creates more unhappiness. What he's getting at here is, is how to make sleep meaningful. And so he's talking about, you know, you would sort of meditate, you know, actually really, I'll go into a little more detail, right? What would you do? So you would sort of, you know, the idea is before bed, actually, in Buddhist practice, one sort of reviews the day, right? And thinks, you know, I set my motivation this morning to practice compassion today. How did I do? And you might think, if you, you know, and you might think, well, this and this and this and this time I messed up. I became impatient with somebody, I was unkind, or whatever. And you would do the purification practice that we went over a little bit, and we'll go over more later in karma. Right? But so you would actually do what's called the 4 powers of purification. So let's say you were mean to somebody, right, or unkind. Well, you would think, well, that's not the kind of person I want to be, and you would do a practice to sort of purify that. Right? If you did good things, you would rejoice. Right? So you would think back and think, oh, I did this, I did that, I meditated on love, I was meditating on bodhicitta, and I studied about emptiness, and I helped somebody. You would think that's great, and you would practice rejoicing. Right? And then you would think, okay, I need to rest, you know, so I can make a good use of tomorrow. And he says ideally, the ideal of Buddhist practice, he says, is you lay down as the Buddha did at the time of the Buddha's death. The Buddha laid down on his right side, in what they call the lion posture. He says that. On your right side, placing your left leg on top of the right one and sleeping like a lion. Actually, they say that the Buddha laid like that and actually closed one nostril, his right nostril. You don't have to do that if it's uncomfortable. Actually, you can do it for a minute if you like, just to experiment. They actually say that that's related to the subtle. There's a whole thing in Tantric Buddhism that describes the subtle energies, energy systems, and energy flows in the subtle channels of the body. So there's actually a meaning to that. That's where that comes from, actually, really. There's a subtle way that affects the subtle energies of the body. That's why I did that, really. And then he says, then as you're falling asleep, he gives an advice. He says, whatever your main practice is, whatever your main contemplation is, whatever you're really cultivating, think of that. He says, and then that will infuse, in some sense, your sleep. And even your sleep will become, what does he say? Even while asleep, it will be similar to when you're not asleep and practicing meditative stabilization. So he's saying, like, and that's true, isn't it, actually? You know, like, if you notice that even in ordinary life, right? If you go to sleep really, like, usually it's the opposite of this, though, in the sense, he's talking about virtuous things, right? In daily life, if you're, like, agitated or upset about something, right, and you go to sleep, then it's there under the surface, right? Even, maybe you dream about it, or you even wake up sort of still with that in the back of your mind. You know, like that happens, right? If somebody's really stressed about work, right? And they say, like you often say, oh, if I have dreams about work, it's like not even get a break. Then I woke up still worrying about it. You know, or if you're in a fight with somebody, right? Let's say you're in a fight and you're really angry with them, right? Then as you're going to sleep, first of all, it's hard to fall asleep, right? Then as you go to sleep, you're sort of still, it's in the back of your mind, the agitation with them. And then when you wake up, actually you don't feel so good, right? So he's saying, let's do the opposite, right? So he's saying, so you kind of lay down and you sort of think about, like, so let's say you were, whatever your topic was, bodhicitta, right? So you would lay down and you would think, like, you know, the purpose of my life is to be of benefit to all sentient beings. My aspiration is to become enlightened for all sentient beings. Right now I'm even sleeping for all beings. You know, in my dream, you know, and you might think, you know, whatever, so you think, may my life be meaningful, may my waking be meaningful, may my sleep be meaningful for all beings, right? And if you fall asleep like that, then that kind of infuses your dream life and your sleeping life. And then you wake up with that still in your mind, and it becomes much easier to realize the topic if you're living in that way. Anyway, so I won't go into more detail. I think that gets at the main essence of what he's getting at. But do you get the point here? Like what, just to conclude, right? So what Lama Tsongkhapa is really talking about is what? Is living a life of mindfulness and of introspection, of awareness, you know, and where you're relating to life in a positive way and trying to cultivate a positive state of mind all the time, right? To make your life meaningful. It's pretty simple. Okay. Any questions? Pretty straightforward. It's not complicated philosophically. It's hard to do, maybe, but it's not. It's not complicated philosophically. Okay, well, so just think about that question, you know, and then we'll send out that email, and you know, people can give their input. And depending on what people decide, maybe we'll adjust the September schedule slightly, depending on what we sort of all decide. We'll keep the 2 days, that we already have 2 days scheduled, but depending on what we all decide, we'll sort of adjust September and October accordingly. Okay, and let's just do those 2 verses we do to conclude, to dedicate the merit, which is what Lama Tsongkhapa advised us to do. The supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara.